Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Subversive Subcultures podcast, a weekly podcast that we have not touched, thought about, or looked at in, God, like 2.5 freaking months now. I am actually alone tonight. My executive emotional producer, Tamara Trotter, who you met in our last episode, is currently down with strep throat, as is my daughter. My co-host of this podcast could not be here tonight. He's having to work late. I just felt like we were long overdue for an update. At the point of our first recording, my co-host Ty could not attend due to inclement weather, or at least that far in the past what we thought inclement weather was. The following week, we were hit by Winter Storm Uri, and while we did attempt a recording, I did this thing called over-imbibing alcohol, and it turned into a colossal shit show. So for the 61 of you who downloaded this podcast in the last 2 months plus, thanks, and hopefully you're still interested in hearing another one. As it stood, Winter Storm Uri not only displaced my wife and I from our apartment, as our lease was ending anyway, it broke our heater. I really, unfortunately, lost housing for 18 families that were in my care with the domestic violence shelter that I work for. So my job quickly turned into 70-hour weeks as we tried to get people displaced. Luckily, we did go viral. We were donated renovation funds, housing funds for our clients who needed it. And almost unfortunately, it was a bit of a double-edged sword. We were inundated by about 1,000 Amazon donations per day for a period of weeks. So while facilitating all of that and handling mostly the grunt force labor of it all, I also had to move my family out of that apartment. And most unfortunately, due to the effects of the winter storm, our house that we were aiming to purchase was delayed by over a month as well. So during that month, we decided to set up a spectacularly fueled bender as a coping mechanism for living in with my mother-in-law, who is a proud Fox News stan. We did finally get the house, and as we were getting settled in, my co-host Ty was actually able to annul his lease due to complications from Winter Storm Uri, and he moved in with me. So why is he not here, you may ask? Well, since my wife and child got strep, I actually got a positive test result back on that today as well. We have been juggling recovering from our COVID vaccinations, which we all did, and we are all recovering from. And our sweet dog passed away at the age of 14, Richard Nixon, who was lovely. We're still dealing with that. So while Ty is making himself scarce around here right now as a result of everybody here having strep throat, my throat is still in okay condition. I was able to head mine off pretty quickly with some horse-sized antibiotics, and rather than do our standard read and commentary, I thought I would just give you all a rather monologue-related story. This is also about a subculture group, unlike our first one, which was about honkies in the 1950s. This one is more steeped in Latin American history, which is definitely more my specialty. This is about grass and roots rebellion, sustainable food practices combating processed culture. Sorry that we won't have all the fun comments from my wife, but if you stay tuned, I'm sure that we will have all kinds of fantastic fake sponsors during our ad breaks. Now, I was fortunate enough to go down to Mexico some years ago on a conference while I was working on my undergraduate degree, and I got to see some of this firsthand, and so it's just a lovely exploration. For more reading on this subject, I would recommend anything written by Jeffrey Pilcher. He's got some quotes thrown into here. He's just a lovely human who, does food history in Mexico. It's fascinating. So in Mexico, and more especially Mexico City, there's a pandemic of obesity, famine, and malnutrition. A small but growing subculture is calling upon the history of its people to try to rectify the situation. From the time of the Aztec people through the conquistador era, the age of independence, and now into the current age of NAFTA, tortilla politics, and globalization, the entirety of the physical and political area surrounding present-day Mexico has changed to an unrecognizable degree. Regardless of the environmental changes, the birth of the machine age, and the oppressive systems of pollution and globalism, the people of Mexico City are reverting back to a lot of the subsistence gardens of old, and the reasons are ones of solidarity, healthy horticultural practices, independence, peaceful rebellion, and reestablished identity. Since the pre-Columbian era, the lands in and around Mexico City have been a hotbed of innovative activity. Before the conquering forces of Western civilization entered the frame, it was a mecca of the Western Hemisphere and boasted the largest city in North America. Goods, namely food, were shipped throughout the Aztec Empire and made their way inevitably to the capital city, then called Tenochtitlan. An impressive canal system dug by the native inhabitants was designed to move around products and commercialize their area, and an inadvertent effect of this digging and irrigation was a rotation of the soils and movement of the waterways, which made vegetable growth in the area more practical and successful. Centuries after the conquest by the Spaniards and after the rebellion and political upheaval that followed, the lands of Mexico were under unsteady control as a constant. For further readings on unsuccessful Caudillo strongness systems of government in Mexico, I'd recommend looking at Dr. Thomas Skidmore and Dr. Smith and Green, who wrote a rather dry textbook called Modern Latin America in 2014. It's wonderful. With this level of chronic instability, no national structure was able to flourish for long, and the Mexican citizenry, as a consequence, were left behind Western civilization, Euro-Western civilization, in terms of industrial development and commercialized food practices. The results of this in regard to culinary development and innovation can be easily extrapolated in that there were none. Even into the beginning of the 20th century, Mexican people of European descent, known as Creoles, and societies like political and entrepreneurial elites still preferred their plates to be reminiscent of more civilized hot cuisine, such as mutton and breads like the European counterparts. This was like a niche market for preparation, and that was an exotic, exclusive, expensive, and inaccessible diet was likely a reason it was never made into an industrialized product in Mexico. Jeffrey Pilcher discussed the advent and revolution of food practices in Mexico in his book Que Vivan los Tamales. After delving into the battle between European tastes versus both native and mestizo food preferences, the food industry of Mexico began its arduous trek of development and mechanization. What Pilcher's book centered on more than anything else was the struggle between the two schools of taste to discern whether or not corn or wheat should be the staple grain of the people. And after laying out this argument, and just when it looked like a compromise may have been reached, globalism and the saturation of the Mexican marketplace affected the argument irrevocably. And a previously non-existent contender stole the battle, which was processed sugars and related products. Again, look at Que Vivan los Tamales, Food in the Making of Mexican Identity, published in 2008. To blame the entirety of the pandemic on a company such as Bimbo or its parent company Gruma would be hard to quantify, but the likelihood of the health issues of the masses without this company in the picture would be hard to refute. This was written by Major del Carmen Morales Ruan, in his article La inseguridad alimentaria está asociada con obesidad en mujeres adultas de Mexico. Fascinating article, and please use Google Translate. I'm not trying to flex here. I do not speak Spanish worth a damn. Fast foods and prepackaged foods have taken the popularity of the population of Mexico by storm, not unlike the poor communities of the United States en masse. The most easily culpable enemy in this scenario is the industry that manufactures and transports these bulk calorie, high sugar food products to the marketplaces. And the easiest means of fighting the pandemic is to live better in spite of the ease of access and eating poorly. The same issues that we run into here in America with food deserts and stuff. It's designed this way and fostered by terrible people. This should appear to be common sense, but as the working class ingests 20% of its daily caloric intake via potato chips and candy, and more through soft drinks and beer, it's clear that some form of caloric redirection is necessary, as Mexican adults now find themselves struggling with both anemia and obesity and some sort of perverse malnutritional irony. Again, this is in Que Vivan los Tamales. The guy did amazing work. Enter the concepts of rooftop and patio gardens and the reintroduction of farmers markets on the same ground where the Aztec markets used to flourish. It's incredible. And from this, a health-conscious preparation of these fresher food options has emerged. Just as American communities have been looking to the past in terms of thinking about our health in relation to food production, Mexico's barrios have been working their own small-scale agendas of combating their own health crises. Tenochtitlan was initially founded amid a large marshy swampland. In these shallow lakes, these swamps, the Aztecs built narrow rectangular islands of sand, decaying vegetation, and mud dredged from the bottom of lakes. It was this terraforming which allowed new plant growth and rudimentary irrigation systems to thrive in extreme fertility. The Aztecs called these chinampas. They were mislabeled floating gardens by the conquistadors. And the concept and execution of horticulture on the chinampas is something that's never been fully abandoned, according to Ernest C. Griffin and Michael Meyer in their textbook, their encyclopedic entry, Mexico, The Rise of the Aztecs. As the swampland which used to surround the city continues to recede, the islands are at a strange crossroads in their composition. While surrounded by grossly polluted water and on often shifty banks, they hold a great potential for plant growth, and a lot of the culinary celebrities of Mexico have taken active roles in the new cultivation, sale, and preparation of produce grown on these lands. This, according to Laura Tillman and A Taste of Ancient Farming in the Los Angeles Times in 2018. The proverbial why behind the defense of this small group of islands may best be answered by a restaurant proprietor of one of these islands. When asked why he stood up to defend them and even go so far as to open a restaurant in the former swamp, Lucio Usubiaga stated in an interview with the LA Times that we're trying to conserve and restore the chinampas. It's a very important environmental area for Mexico City, and it's threatened by many factors: urban sprawl, pollution, and the initial abandonment of the chinampas. You know who won't abandon your chinampas? Is the products and services that make this podcast possible. Stay tuned.
Brought to you by Jolly Donnie's Dingle Jingles.
Dingle Bringles.
Jingles for all your dingles.
If you're looking for a piece of quick progress.
So if you need a jingle for your dingle, or a dingle for your Pringus, come down to Jolly Donnie's Jingles Dingles for your dingly jinglies. And don't forget to ask about our dangles. We will give you 10% off. No, you're good.
So, we're talking chinampas. Thanks for staying tuned. Hope you enjoyed those ads. Hope they weren't dick pills. If they were, maybe go for them. I don't care. I have no idea who sponsors this podcast. The champions of the cause of the chinampas aren't exclusively hipsters or avant-garde members of Mexico's budding artisanal culinary movement, but actually the most unlikely of heroes, anarchists from the Mexico City punk scene. This according to Holly Wren and her articles, Like Flowers Breaking Through the Cement, published in The Ecologist in April of 2003. The anarcho-punk scene was established in the city around 1984 in tandem with the punk movement in the United States. The primary goals of the subculture at the time of its inception also mirrored the punks of the U.S. insofar as they played loud, fast music and made speeches against, all authority. It's, once again, fascinating reads. One that you could look up would be The History of Punk in Mexico Told by Themselves by Jose Javier Navarre. Super riveting read. Again, no shame in Google Translate there. By the mid-1990s, the punks had evolved and organized. The induction of NAFTA in 1994 was a major turning point in establishing agency in their movement. Beyond the standard of raging against the state, punks now had developed a proper cause of rallying against global oppression. They backed the uprisings of indigenous farmers, declaring themselves the EZLN, or a Zapatista Army of National Liberation, against the government of the Mexican state of Chiapas. And by the end of the 20th century, this radicalized subculture was protesting exclusionary education practices, putting on DIY fundraisers for the EZLN, and pioneering sustainable horticulture and environmentalist programs in their Mexico City neighborhoods. Dude, their shit rules. I feel like we were way behind the curve on that one. A considerable majority of the punks involved in the scene were actually born into poor rural circumstances and came to the cities of Mexico for work. They became punks. The reason that they did, it actually speaks to the group's habits of acceptance and the use of punk fashion as an urban camouflage. I have an entire paper on that later. Don't exhaust yourself here. Holly Wren, the Flowers Through Cement author, the anarcho-punks in her article not only started rooftop and patio growing collectives in the late 90s and early 2000s, but have since 2003 begun community garden initiatives, clean water movements, and compost and recycling programs in the neighborhoods of Mexico City. These activists, primarily a group called the Juventud Antiterrorista Revolucionaria, or JAR. In English, that's the Anti-Authoritarian and Revolutionary Youth. They go through their respective neighborhoods in their off hours from their, I'm sure, grueling jobs, clad in vested shoulder spikes and mohawks, trying to effect positive change through healthy food growth and consumption. The impact of this group is ever-changing and expanding, as the members are constantly exploring new means of stability and subsistence for gardening in the urban climate. One difference in practicality worth noting is the extremity of idealism in those urban youth. To quote from Holly Wren, quote, "It is not an intellectual exercise for the JAR, as it often is for middle-class wannabe revolutionaries in the North. It's a matter of survival," end quote. Unlike the chefs of the Chinampas, whose revolution is about conservation of lands and cultures, or the Subsecretaría de Regulación y Fomento Sanitario y Seguridad de Salud, which just allowed cheaper quality products to thrive at lower prices in the open market, the anarcho-punk's primary goal was a garden started in protest. Like, unconscionably, understatably badass, right? This group of individuals, in addition to punk music, gardening, and fashion, have been accused of being anti-globalism and anti-establishment. This from an article by Alan O'Connor. While there may be truth in this accusation, there's an undeniable truth also that their endeavors, regardless of ulterior motive, are creating positive changes in people whom they directly contact. The punks then sell their wares in the most ancient marketplace called the Tianguis del Chopo. The punk scene of Mexico could not have existed, developed, or mobilized had it not been for the Tianguis del Chopo. This bazaar has been open weekly since 1980 and functions as a central hub for the punk activity in Mexico City. According to the historian and punk aficionado Alan O'Connor, a professor from Canada, quote, "The Tianguis is an institution that dates back to the period before the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. It's a temporary market, but also an important social institution," end quote. Despite heavy policing and raids, which the police say are to search for drugs and the punks say are simply moves of oppression, this marketplace has been an iconic networking ground since 1980, and local vendors and permanent surrounding establishments peddle beer and pulque to the crowds. Pulque, those of you not in the know, is this alcoholic beverage made from fermenting fruits, and it is brutal if you're not used to it. Acquired taste does not even begin to cover it, and it's looked down as like less civilized than beer and wine, but it's like a ridiculously important staple beverage of like the working class. In this market, punks also service farmers markets, selling what they've grown and cooking up fresh food from it also. They've possibly inadvertently taken a page from Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma. The prevailing wisdom of the present age is that the best means of becoming healthy is to drastically reduce the consumption of processed foods and excess sugars, and they not only grow these foods, but prepare and sell them in easily accessible marketplaces to their communities. The municipal government of Mexico City, although somewhat lackadaisical to come to action against rampant consumerism, the might of profits and the taxes generated as a result, no longer can ignore the change that's in the rooftop gardens of the working classes, and has to date offered more than 3,000 permits on those rooftop gardens. That is backed up by 10 unique urban agricultural projects in Mexico City from the online magazine Food Tank in 2016. Other businesses, some of which are nonprofit and others which are even governmentally allied, have since been founded. Sembradores Urbanos is a Mexico City-based nonprofit organization which founded Centro de Agricultura Urbana Romita, a massive rooftop garden which essentially functions as an interactive educational center as well as a garden, teaching locals and children who are interested in these pursuits how to build vertical and hydroponic systems as well as traditional agricultural practices. Organizations such as these are utilizing the model of sustenance gardening, but for a plethora of reasons beyond healthy food offerings or fighting the man, Cultiva Ciudad is another nonprofit which, has ulterior motive beyond making more accessible healthy foods. This nonprofit organization has contracts with area schools to both feed and teach horticulture and botany to children. The National Cancer Institute's Support Center for Integrated Care now is a therapeutic garden built by Cultiva Ciudad, which gives cancer patients a new place in which to grow and soothe. It's so sick. The primary plants grown in this garden can also have cancer-combating properties, allegedly, according to the garden's literature. And that website is fairly buggy if you try to go to it, but they do keep an active Facebook page. Again, I know the fact-checking on that's spotty, and plants which combat cancer properties are spotty, but it is still very much worth a look, if for no other reason than gardening is therapeutic and awesome as hell. Furthermore, the Cultiva Ciudad was the primary sponsor of both the Centro de Autismo Teleton, a therapeutic sensory garden for autistic children and adults, and Huerto del Loco. Man, my Spanish is bad. Which boasts, quote, an edible forest with 45 tree varieties, a seed bank, and a large section of biointensive gardening. That is from Roberts et al. With the 10 unique urban agriculture projects in Mexico City. Even in the midst of all this clean living reform, the public of Mexico is still plagued with so many of these health crises mentioned before: diabetes, anemia, obesity, all these things. Some people defend the Mexican means of fast food as healthier, such as Jeffrey Pilcher in the preface of Planet Taco, wherein he describes the Mexican ideal of fast food as costing nearly the same as American fast food in terms of both time and money. But what this doesn't take into account is the calories ingested, the sedentary lifestyle of modern populations, or the excessive sweetening and salting of Mexican meats as a comparative to the chemical additives you would find in American food. The direction to take is one of continuing the theme of food and Mexican identity as written by Pilcher and Que Vivan Los Tamales rather than Planet Taco, or follow the narrative of Michael Pollan in The Omnivore's Dilemma, expounding more upon grassroots food movements in Mexico City since the Gruma Corporation essentially took over mainstream agriculture in the mid-1990s rather than succumbing to it. In a casual conversation of Mexican food in the United States, the words taco, burrito, and enchilada would be used fairly consistently. Occasionally, one might mention the chimichanga, torta, or al pastor. Commonly, the finished products are mentioned with little regard to the natural roots of the food, and the bounty of indigenous vegetables is all but forgotten in the American representations of these classic dishes. Walking into a Mexican market, such as La Michoacan or an El Rancho Supermercado, the shopper is swarmed by loud signs advertising these prepackaged snack foods by Bimbo, the refreshing taste of Coca-Cola, or the option to purchase pre-marinated meats, which take all the guesswork and toil out of doing it in their own kitchen, or any ties to generational intrigue. In the shops of Mexico City, this is becoming a similar problem. What the rebellious punks and social reforming nonprofit organizations are attempting to bring back is not simply a better diet, but a return of being conscious of the foods their neighborhoods consume. Their banners of advertisement are handwritten, the colors limited to the hues of their peppers and greens of their leaves, and the battle will be hard won against the billboards in their city's food deserts. Since 1994, the year in which NAFTA was enacted, JAR has stood for this fight against what they see as corporate greed and the might of profits at the expense of the health and lives of poorer sects of the population, the, quote, desperation of millions of people who are left with no way to live but in humiliation, apathy, and egoism, end quote. All quotes from the JAR were taken from the Holly Grant article, by the way. So, yeah, super cool group doing just amazing work to combat the bad of the world. As this podcast goes on, there's definitely a theme to my research as I went through most of my college years, which was trying to find subcultural groups, mainly with anti-authoritarian stances. A lot of that's projection, but frankly, it's more interesting than hearing about Rebel Without a Cause for the millionth time in your life. Promise you we will never bring up Holden Caulfield on a positive light on this podcast. That sounds fucking miserable. But hopefully we can get back on track with some regular recordings. Hopefully you guys find some of this subject matter interesting. And hopefully you buy the products and services that pay for this podcast. Gotcha again. Music for this podcast, as always, was brought to you by the Dead Name Revival. Sometimes the Dead Name Revival is a 3-piece, sometimes it's just 2, sometimes it's 7. It's just this weird floating group that meets in random garages in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. Good group of guys. And girls. that happens. Anyway, you guys have a great night, or day, or whenever you're listening to this, and hopefully we can be a bit more on track next week. It's been an absolute pleasure. We're going to let the Dead Name Revival play you out.
I'll probably go down there tonight. Probably see a couple friends. Everybody needs to go to the church on Easter. And you never forget to put on your black eye makeup. Or your long coat. Or your boots. If you got boots, I mean. It's cool if you don't got boots. It's just the little things in life, you know? Just like going out and having a good time. And saying, you know, inspirational quotes like, hey, have a nice night. Or, you know, happy Easter. Because, you know, like, even though it's a golf club, they call it church. But that's because, like, everybody's got to have somewhere to go on Sunday, and, you know, I don't care what they say about the Smiths over there, and I don't care. If you prefer the Cure, I don't care. Too much for Jesus, that's what they said. That's what they said. Down at the church. So I guess my church is just like everybody else's church. There's just some cool kids, a couple of guys trying to get laid, a couple of girls trying to get married, a couple of people who don't really know what they're doing with their life, and a whole lot of people who never really cared about what God thought. And I don't care too much for Jesus, and neither did the Presbyterians or the Catholics or the Church of Christ, Baptists especially, Catholics, any Protestants. You know, I think the only person who ever really actually cared about Jesus Christ as a concept, I think we're the Buddhists. Yeah. At the end of the day, you know, I think Jesus would have made a great Buddhist. But the Buddha hates all you fucking Christians. And I do not care too much for your Jesus. No. Oh no. 'Cause the Jesus that I know, he was a lot better guy than you really think he was. Happy Easter, everybody.
Fucking stinks in here.